Here we go. All right, drum roll, please, everybody. Welcome to yet another class. And tonight we're really lucky to have Alonso here with us. And Alonso's day job is that of Arlington County. I'm sure everybody knows Alonso, but I will read the bio anyway. His day job is that of Arlington County's Natural Resources Manager, but he wears many hats outside of work. Also known as the Capital Naturalist, Alonso has a big following on Facebook and YouTube and his own blog. Alonso is also a master naturalist and a master gardener and has been instructing for those organizations for many years. All righty, Alonso, it's all yours. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you very much. And again, I'm going to shrink you guys down so I won't be able to see or whatever. But thank you guys for inviting me. As you guys may have known, I started all of this as a naturalist and interpreter. Therefore, I would do yearly 500 classes a year, things like that. And then I got promoted, as it were, to basically being a paper pusher. So anytime I could do presentations and stuff like that, I'm all for it. So thank you guys very much. So I'm shrinking you guys down and so forth. And I will do some shameless self-promotion here. Again, if you don't follow me on my Capital National social media stuff, please, I invite you to do it. I have a blog. I got over 31,000 to follow me on Facebook. I got over 800 videos. So please, if I got some really cool stuff out there too, because I was always been an educator. So there you go. My contact information is right there too. One, of course, at work, and then my other one, of course, having to do with my Capital Naturalist stuff. So, folks, I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about trees and so forth, woody plants. And one of the big things that I did want to mention about that is, why do we, bother with using natives and things like that, not just for gardening, but why they're important out there. And so I probably don't need to tell you this, but I'm going to do it anyways, because the reason I'm focusing on all of these things have to do that native trees, of course, provide the absolute best habitat value. And that's why I learned about them. And the neat thing about, plants and trees is you may be a specialist here, you may be a specialist there, and whatever. I'm a generalist, but I'll tell you something. If you don't know the plants, you're kind of limited in a lot of the other stuff, because everything depends on the plants. And so it behooved me, I think, a long time ago to get, working knowledge of some of the plants and stuff that are out there, enough now that I feel qualified to at least talk to regular folks about some of the different kinds of plants that we have which are natives. So anyways, one big thing, and I'll just go right down these bullets, of course, because the animals evolve with them, therefore, those are the ones that provide the best food and shelter. Why? They've evolved together. I mean, a lot of the plants and what they look like is due to evolutionary trends where the animals picked why they appear that way, right? And for that reason, they are the most preferred food sources all the way through. And because, of course, they grew in our area and we have so many different kinds of species. It goes back, and again, I was a master gardener. The old adage of right plant, right place. I mean, they're adapted to our soil conditions. So most of these grew up in the typical soils we have in our areas. Depending on what soils you have, what elevation you have, whatever, there are plants which have evolved to make use of that niche. Okay, and there's tons to choose from. Just so you know, just in Northern Virginia, there were 1,700 different species. Okay, and that's just in Northern Virginia. And just to just give you a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more information on that. At one time, Arlington used to be one of the most diverse places around. I mean, now we've built it all over, 40 of it's paved, all this kind of stuff. But regardless, at one point, 28% of all the native plants found in Virginia were found right in our little tiny, Arlington County. So we were a very diverse place. I mean, we have lots of things moving in from the south where, we straddle, of course, a couple of different biozones. We have all these different reasons why there were tons of plants over here. Okay. So, and it's still a great place to be a naturalist because of these different kinds of things. The other thing I want to mention is that and you'll see as I go through this. Of course, you can plant plants, you can learn the plants and whatever, but people have always depended on plants, whether they're aesthetically, whether they're for planting, whether they're medicinal, whether all sorts of other uses, as well as the wildlife. And so all of these plants have multiple uses, including by people. And again, I'm just going to explain a few of those things as we go along. And the other big thing I want to mention is because they support so many different things, many different kinds of insects are these native plants they host. They are very strictly specialists that only depend on one plant. So about 50% or so of the insects eat plants, okay? And of those, about the 50% or so, 90% of these are specialists, meaning they feed on one genera, one genus or one family of plants, okay? And that's important because 96 of all land birds and all 18 bats in the mid-Atlantic feed on the insects that our native plants produce. And so, again, just one of the reasons why I'm talking about natives more so than anything else. So again, you see here, this is during one of those eruption years when we had a ton of the fall webworms. And you can see this one, I can't even count how many fall webworms this common grackle is collected, but he's got them he's got a ton of them. He's going to feed his young there. We probably have to thank all of the insects that we have during the summer for the great diversity of birds we have, as well as for migration. I mean, one of the reasons that birds migrate, it's not so much it's too cold for them, but it is too cold for their foods. If most of them, especially when they're nesting, are feeding on caterpillars and sawflies and so forth, there aren't a lot of them around in the wintertime. Therefore, they go down to Latin America and whatever, compete with the birds there, but they time their return back for when these insects are abundant so they can feed their young. And that's a pretty important thing. And just so you know, a lot of people put up all sorts of things which really don't work, things like bat boxes, whatever. And in reality, the best thing you can do to support our native bats is plant native plants, because those support the insects that they all feed on. Okay, so there you go. So here I have a little comparison. This is some of the stuff I've gotten from Talamy, and these are old dated ones. So, for example, over here in the woody plants, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here the top one there says Quercus, the oaks, right? The oak family, and that's way out of date. There's actually 557 to 556 species supported, so these need to be updated. But there you go. But here you see how many things they support, and then on the right hand side, I put together some of the other plants that we have, both woodies on top and perennials down below, and you'll notice the comparison between the two is not even close. I mean, most of the plants which people plant all the time support almost nothing, right? I mean, so if you plant the ginkgo, you're supporting nothing really, okay? I mean, there are reasons you want to plant this because for these different kinds of things, but habitat value is not one of them, okay? Zelkovas, whatever the case may be. So, another big thing out there is when you're thinking wildlife, you need to know the plants, and this is the reasons why. Most of these things depend, most of these insects and things like that depend on certain species of plants, and then they feed other things on down the line. So you got to learn the plants if you want to be good at a good naturalist about knowing any of the other stuff too. You have to at least have a working knowledge of the native plants in order to know that a little bit better. Okay, so as another continuing example, this is some examples that took place right over here in Baltimore, in some studies that were done by Talamy, one of its students. It turns out that it takes about 9,120 insects to raise one brood of 3 Carolina chickadee nestlings, okay? And the study also showed that when they went through there, that about 70% of native biomass, so that in its range, wherever its home range is of these Carolina chickadees, if you don't have 70% native biomass, then the chickadees were not going to survive. Less than 70, most of the time, they did not survive. And those that did, that had 60% chance less likely to try and breed. The next that's had 1.5 fewer eggs and 1.2 fewer fledglings even survived the fledgling state. And so all of these things mean that without the native plants, these guys just can't live. So some people say, well, why don't we just feed them or whatever? And folks, that's not going to do it. You need the protein and so forth that's made up in a lot of these things, particular caterpillars, in order to feed their young. As an example, when they were doing this study, they actually did go out there and look for locations where cavities and so forth, and where people put nest boxes in order to study the chickadees. And they found out a couple of things, one of which was this would, again, that 70%, those things that have, for example, oak trees and things like that, that is what the Carolina chickadees needed in order to survive. Those places, even though they had bird feeders out there, um, that did not have native plants, the chicklings did not survive. In fact, one of the stories, which was relayed to me by one of the people who did one of the studies, he said that he found a few places where they investigated the nests afterwards to see how they were doing and so forth, and they found in some of the nests, the nestlings were in there with their crops, where they store their food, full of seeds, but the birds were dead. Why? Because you cannot raise your young on bird seed. Okay, if you want future chickadees and other types of birds, it's just an example, then you have to have the native plants support those insects. Bird feeders don't do it, period. And that's the bottom line of a lot of these different lessons. And that's why I'm talking to you guys about native trees and things like that, because of how important they are to the habitat value that they provide. So,
hey, Alonso.
Yeah.
Excuse me just a second. Could you just maybe not everybody knows who Doug Tallamy is. So if you could just take a second to tell us who it is.
So Doug Tallamy, and you'll see Doug Tallamy in a couple more slides through here. So Doug Tallamy is, of course, an entomologist from Delaware, and this professor has written some great books all about how people in their own backyards can do a lot to support wildlife. And he has all sorts of different things about him, which I'll talk about in a couple more slides. But the bottom line is he wanted to show the people, hey, the importance of habitat value can be provided right in your own backyard, because there aren't enough parks to support wildlife. If you look at Arlington County, I'll go right back to where we are. I mean, most of it is paved. We have 7% left of our natural land left in our parks. Everything else is built up or paved over, or is a recreation area, or the case may be. So preserving just 7-8% of the parks is not enough to support all the wildlife. It just can't. And so it's very important that homeowners and so forth do what they can, especially those that abut our parks, by planting native plants and so forth, because they're providing the habitat value for all of these. And he talks a little bit more about that, and I'll get to it a little bit later. But Doug Tallamy, of course, brought this to the forefront. I've heard him speak 4 or 5 times, and I actually interviewed him, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But I mean, he talked about the importance of all these different kinds of the native plants, and how native plants, of course, support all sorts of other wildlife. Okay. And again, so the other big thing, another thing, and this comes to another idea by Doug Tallamy, which he talks about the homegrown national park movement. And it goes something like this. And as I mentioned, if you were to combine all of the largest national parks in the United States and put them together, they would not amount even close to the number of private properties, which, if those people were to convert their yards into a more native, and I don't mean, there has to be everything in there is native, but if they did, a little bit, and planting enough native plants, it would more than double the amount of habitat that we have in the United States. And so he's providing this thing. It's called the Homegrown National Park Movement, all of this. And one of the parts about it is that all native plants are not all the same either, okay? And you can see examples right over here. So there are keystone plants, those plants which are so important that they form the basis of a lot of the insects, which then form the basis of the food for many other kinds of animals. So 5% of the genuses, the genera, hosts about 3/4 of the butterfly and moth species that we have. And because those are the most important things that our birds feed on when they're raising their young, by planting some of these keystone plants or preserving them, whatever you can go a long ways, because 3/4 of the caterpillars feed on this, and that feeds everything up the food chain. Okay. And again, some examples over here. And by the way, on the left-hand side in the willows, again, you can see 455 caterpillars, right? But here's a willow sawfly, and sawflies to most people, there's big differences. They're actually more related to wasps than anything else, but sawflies look like caterpillars to most people, and they form another very important food item for our birds, okay? So anyways, these are just some examples of some keystone plants, and again, some of the habitat value they provide, okay? There you go. So we're going to go now specifically in some, well, actually, before I go specifically into the plants that I'm talking about, is there anything in general that I mentioned anyone has any questions about? Great.
Nothing in, nothing in the chat yet.
Excellent. So we'll go on, let's go on with the oaks first, okay? And let's talk about a very common oak, which has some incredible wildlife value, and that's white oak, okay? So when you look at white oak, which again make up a good portion of the oak species that we have in Arlington, and by the way, we have dozens of kinds in Arlington. I think that, if I remember correctly, the DMV area has something like 42 different species of oaks, as well as the hybrids. Okay, so the oaks hybridize quite readily, right? And so this is a very important tree, which is incredibly important because they host 557 caterpillar species. Plus, you can add in there, some of the soft flies and other things too. So that's important because, like I mentioned, that supports 96% of the land birds and nesting birds that we have, as well as all 18 of our bats that feed on those caterpillars as either caterpillars or when they turn into moths and butterflies, right? But a lot more than that. In fact, there's 805 gall-making species, of which 550 are these little tiny wasps, which are so tiny that you fly through the eye of a needle. I mean, these tiny little wasps which form these galls on these trees, and that feeds so many more things. In fact, well, let me just finish all of this first. So there's over 40 different kinds of mammals to feed on acorns, okay? 60 plus different kinds of birds to feed on acorns, especially those that produce the small acorns like pin oaks and willow oaks and things like that. But the tree itself hosts 61 wood-boring beetles that, bore inside of them, 21 leafhoppers, 37 tree hopper species, all of this. In fact, if you were to look at all of this, if the oaks were to go extinct tomorrow, and, that can happen. I mean, we're noticing all sorts of fungi and all sorts of diseases coming through. Look what happened, of course, to the American chestnut, that kind of thing. And bottom line is, if that were to happen, 600 species would go extinct. Why? Because those 600 species only feed on oaks. Many of these other caterpillar species, they feed on more than just oaks. They prefer oaks, perhaps, whatever, but many of these species are solely reliant on oaks. And so oaks disappear, 600 species disappear overnight as well. So it's a very important keystone plant, and that's why I'm mentioning it now. But it has some other cool things about it. So, for example, when we start losing all of the when you start losing soon all of the leaves on our trees, you'll notice that a few trees will hold on to their leaves, and that's called marcescence. I got a nice little write-up on it, one of my blogs, and again, it's just these leaves which don't completely lose, that hang on to the leaves for a long period of time. It's a neat story about it. If you have time, I'll tell you. But it's easy to tell these trees too, because they're one of the handful of trees which hold on to the leaves in the wintertime. And so if you're going by there and you see leaves on a tree or something like that, gives you another clue as to what species is out there, because it could very well be an oak. But it was also useful for all sorts of different kinds of things, and in particular white oaks, because of their ability to seal together and so forth. We're used in making barrels, building lumber, that kind of thing, ships, whatever, which is very different from the other groups of oaks. Okay, they divide up oaks into two different families. Okay, you get the white oaks. Okay, and those have basically lobes around them. They don't have any little hairs or whatever, points on the end of them. Okay, and they produce every single year. Whereas in the red and black oaks, they produce every 2 years. They have more tannins in them, and not only that, but you can't use their things for building barrels or shipbuilding or whatever, because they don't seal very well, and because of it, doing something like that means that your ship is going to sink, that sort of thing. So again, this is a really, really cool plant, a really, really cool tree. And again, there's too many to go over, but just to give you an example of one, I'm talking about the white oak over here. And again, one of the big things about them, because they have lots of tannins in them, particularly the red oaks and things like that, they were used, for example, for leather tanning, that kind of thing too. And people realize the importance of these things. It is the state tree of Connecticut and Maryland, for example. Okay, so it does have a lot of really really cool things to them. And because of that, Doug Tallamy wrote one whole book about this, the most important species. He argues about why he thinks it's the most important species of all the different of all the different trees that we have, actually all the different plants that we have. And he talks about nature of oaks, and you see some of the reasons why. A lot of stuff I collected are not from Talamy. I collected on my own and so forth. So, any mistakes that you see in the different species and things like that, you can chalk them up to me. The only things I got from Talamy, even though he does have some great stuff in this particular book of oaks, are the caterpillar species and things like that. And if you want to learn more about this, you can buy his book and read it. Or if you want to learn more about what I did interview him as part of the Native Plant Podcast, John McGee is a really good friend of mine. And so I've been able to host several of his different podcasts. And so I do have one on Doug Talamy. You can learn a little bit about him by listening to it and whatever. And, John McGee, who knows that I use Doug Talamy's work a lot in some of the work they did, was nice enough to offer it up to let me be one of the people to interview him. So thanks to John about that. So you guys can read a little bit more about that. So one of the other things, and again, this is not a tree ID class. I'm talking about some of the more common trees and things like that. But just to get a couple of the important things out of the way, and one of these is this, this saying that people have to help you memorize, the alternate versus the opposite branched trees. Okay, now this is an old dated thing, but when I was a naturalist, this is one of the things that I learned to help simplify things when I was outdoors. Okay, so the saying is mad capped horse, and mad, all in capital letters. Mad stands for the maples, the ashes, and the dogwoods, all of which are opposite. So opposite mean if there's one on one side, there will be another opposite branch on the other. And you can see here some examples of some of these here up at the top, and on the bottom, alternate ones where there are branches, but they're not opposite each other. One's on one side, then another one's on the other side, and so forth. They're alternate. Okay, so the opposite branching on the twigs and branches is can be summed up in what they say madcap taurus. As I mentioned, mad, maples, ashes, and dogwoods. And that doesn't mean that every one of these, there are dogwoods for alternate leaf dogwood, right? Which is not opposite, but it covers most of them as well as most of the non-native ones. The cap is for a non-existent family. It used to be Caprifoliaceae, and Caprifoliaceae was all the honeysuckles, the viburnums, all of these things together. And at one time, they put all of these shrubs into one single family, Caprifoliaceae, and now, as we learn more about these, they separate them out. But for me, who, learned this stuff, ages ago, I mean, I've been a professional naturalist, for 30 some years. So I learned it this way, but of course it's changed quite a bit. So that's what the cap stands for, is those things in the honeysuckle, viburnum, elderberries, all of those things as well. All right. The horse is interesting because that's for horse chestnuts. And that can include things like buckeyes and things like that. And this really does help, as far as, identifying or helping you to tell one plant for another. Madcap horse. If you look at it, first thing you should look on the plants or whatever. One of the first things you look at are the branching alternate or are they opposite? And if they're opposite, then it likely fits into one of these categories that I mentioned. And these are much fewer a number of trees than the the alternate ones, which hold the vast number of all of our tree species. And one such tree is the dogwood. Again, all the Cornus group have this. And again, they all have opposite branching. And as a group, they're really good. I mean, they host 118 caterpillar species. And because these fruits, especially they're producing now in the fall, when a lot of these birds, the insects starting to run out and they need to fatten up the flying south, they feed on the drupes, okay, the quote unquote fruits of these trees. And it's very, very important because these things are high in lipids and proteins, which help them in our migration. And here are just a few examples of of the different kinds of dogwood you can find locally. And I will say one of them is the alternate leaf or pagoda dogwood. Again, it's the one dogwood that is not opposite branching, okay? And then a couple of them which are planted. Kusa is planted all over the place, and it's probably where the the anthracnose came in that unfortunately is wiping out many of our other dogwoods. Okay, it was a fungus that was brought in the horticultural trade on the Kusa, and it doesn't kill the Kusa, but unfortunately our own native plants, native Cornus species are not adapted to it, and so does wipe them out. And another one which is planted all over the place, the red osier, it's not local. People plant it as a native plant. It technically is not native to here, but it's very commonly bred, so there you go. The one that is native to here is the silkwood or swamp dogwood, but we have many different kinds around here. And of course, the most important of which is our state tree, the flowering dogwood in Cornus, Florida. And again, all the things that apply to it. It also feeds about 16 different mammals that feed on these fruits themselves, 12 different kinds of beetles. It has, if you look close, you can't really see in these pictures here, what some people call alligator bark, just how rough the bark is on itself. And this is a neat thing. And that is, this is true of many different kinds of plants, but I'm going to talk specifically about flowering dogwood because this shows it the most. It's what's called foliar fruit flagging. So at the same time that the fruits are ripening themselves, that the foliage is changing also to a red color, right? And the beauty of that is if a bird is flying by, it's hard to pick out one droop here and one droop there on a plant, especially if it's in the middle of the woods, right? Because in the middle of the woods, it may not produce as many droops, as many fruits as those that get more sunlight out, outdoor, out on the edge or something. But a bird flying by that picks up that there is a lot of scarlet color out there. Again, birds can see color, at least all the daytime flying birds really can. And so they home in on it. And when they find this really bright colored tree, they can come into it, and then they find the fruits growing in there. And again, it's called a foliar fruit flagging. It basically flags down the migratory bird saying, here I am. The fruits are right now. Come and eat them. And then they fly on off, and where they poop, they plant another dogwood tree complete with fertilizer, right? And that's kind of how it goes. So again, it is our state flower and tree. There's, it's also the state flower from North Carolina, the state tree for Missouri, all sorts of neat things about it. And you can find a lot of this too. I have two different blogs on this if you want to listen a little bit to them, but I'll tell you a little bit more. Some of it have to do with how different indigenous people use them. And so the Cherokee and a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you now comes from Daniel Moorman's great treatise on how the indigenous people here in North America use their plants. And I will also mention a lot of things in there are for example, the Cherokee, which were the first of the tribes to come up with their own written language. And because they would write this stuff down and things like that, a lot of that stuff got recorded, whereas it's a little bit less of the other stuff. And again, the Cherokee, for example, used this, used the bark itself when they had headaches. They thought it was really good at controlling worms. So if you had, if you had, as a vermifuge is what they call it, if you had worms in your stomach, this would help get rid of the intestinal worms. But they also used to treating diarrhea, ulcers, measles, for treating fevers, whatever. Now, there is another really cool thing. And again, war always breeds all sorts of inventions, okay? And during the Civil War over here, the South was blockaded, and therefore there were many things that they used to be able to purchase that they no longer could purchase. And so early on in the war, they basically put together a group of different kinds of doctors and so forth to find alternate uses for plants that they could no longer get. And that was by a guy named Francis Porcher. And Francis Porcher, he had his own unit. It was amazing, some of the neat stuff that he put together, out of necessity of what they could use. And so it's a really long name, but most people call it Confederate ethnobotany. Okay, ethnobotany means how people use plants. And he specifically used the flowering dogwood as a substitute for quinine. Okay, and quinine used to be, of course, mostly coming from Peru, which is my home country. They will use it mostly for treating malaria. When you could not get that anymore, then they started using, they started promoting that dogwood would be something you can use it for it. Okay, and he was convinced that it was even better than the quinine out of Peru, right? But again, he also mentioned it used for fevers. He also said that because this is the military times, this made some of the more superior gunpowder you can get, which was pretty important. He actually said it's better than willows and other types of things for that. And he also thought that the fruits, if you were to ingest them, they would be good for fever. So there's lots of different kinds of reasons why, flowering dogwood was such an important thing for, an important thing. And I always like to start with it because it is a state tree. Most people recognize it and things like that. And even in wintertime, it's easy to identify the neat little fruits or everything on it. If you want to know more about it, go ahead to those blogs. You can learn more about dogwood and some of the other uses for it. The next one I'm going to talk about is probably the tulip tree. Some call it a poplar, but it's not a poplar, okay? It's actually a tulip tree, and I got another blog on this one too. It is a very, very tall tree, okay? In fact, it's the tallest deciduous tree that we have here in the East, okay? And it's third in the East, the third widest trunks. In fact, I got to pick pictures of my family, and I'm Latino. We have large families. All of us right in front of a tulip tree, and the tulip tree, we stand right in front of it. It was 20 some feet wide. I mean, my whole family fit right in front of these things, right? So this is a very, very important tree. It's very fast growing, and it grows really straight. And because it grows really straight, and because it tends to drops its lowest branches, it self-prunes, okay? So the lowest branches are dropped. You can see the scars of where the branches used to be. It grows tall and straight. Now, because it's growing tall and straight, it sacrifices some of the durability to grow that fast and give it a competitive edge, right? Now, so it grows really, really tall, but the problem is that means that the wood is not as strong as, for example, oaks or other types of things. But that meant that it was very, very important for the indigenous people. Another name for this is canoe wood. Why? Well, back in the day, of course, the people, the Algonquin-speaking people here in Virginia, right? The Powhatans, the Kanoi, if you're on the Maryland side, whatever the case may be. But those people spoke Algonquin. They used dugout canoes, but they didn't have any metallurgy. I mean, did have some copper. They beat in some nice little decorations, whatever, jewelry, but they really didn't have any metallurgy. And so anything they had to be stone, bone, or wood, right? And so you had to be able to take down a tree using stone, bone, or wood. And what they could do that with this, you could burn and chop, bring it on down, chop it all open, and it's amazing. These made some gigantic canoes. In fact, Captain John Smith, when he was one of his voyages over here, he was greeted, of course, by, in this case, the Powhatan Indians. They were in some dugout canoes, and him being a military man, he quickly counted how many archers were meeting him. And he said, wow, one of these dugout canoes had 40 archers. And so, it's amazing how big these things can be. Anyways, it is a pretty cool little tree. It hosts about 21 different kinds of caterpillar species. So it's not great for that kind of a wildlife value as compared, again, as we mentioned, the dogwood with 118 or the oaks or whatever, but it's still pretty important. It does grow very, very quickly. And I did want to mention, again, the Cherokee, for example, used it for controlling pinworm, again, for boils, for rheumatism, whatever the case may be. And again, our buddy Porcher in his Confederate Ethnobotany, he used to, he also talks about as a substitute again for quinine. He was not convinced that just flying dog would do it, so he thought that this could also be used as well. All right. It's a very, very huge, very, very cool tree. About 30% of our honey comes, when this is in bloom, comes from this tree because it's a favorite for them to come over there. And you can actually drink, eat it's so juicy, you can actually get a lot of the nectar right from a flower if it drops off. But be careful because they attract tons of ants. So before you stick it in your mouth, make sure that there are no ants on it. Okay. So that's that. Before I continue, any questions? Otherwise, I'll continue with my next couple of species.
Yeah, we got one question. Well, first of all, one statement is I put the link to your interview with Doug Tallamy in the chat. If anybody
Thank you.
Copy that. And we have a question. Kristen is asking, how do they measure these things? And I assume, Kristen, you mean how do they measure how many caterpillars, things like that?
Yeah. And
yes.
Those numbers have changed quite a bit. And basically, that's why you got grad students, right? They go out there, they search the literature, they find out, okay, this caterpillar was found on this and it was eating it. Okay. And once they do that, they can say, okay, chalk this one up for an oak tree, chalk this one up for a tulip tree, all of these kinds of things. And so it's the collection of all these records from many other studies that have been out there. And again, one of the neat things about caterpillars and moths, and I mean, it's caterpillars, butterflies and moths, is that they're very well liked by people. There's tons of literature on these things because people, they show up, they're easy to see. They're, for the most part, many of them are fairly easy to tell apart, but especially it's for those reasons. Birds are a little bit differently, but again, people have observed them, and so they list them then as different kinds of things. There is a really cool book which I got some of my information from called I don't think they have it anymore. It's called the Landscaping for Birds, I think it's called. And, in there, they talk about many of the different bird species that look to it. So there are some great websites that you can look on or whatever. And what I've done is in my past times, I've collected as much as information as I could. And some of it has been published. For example, I helped put together Audubon when they were coming, and National Wildlife Federation were coming across with some of their Audubon at home suggestions and things like that. They did ask me if I could provide some different kinds of examples, and so I did. And it's just not that I discovered any of them. Much of the stuff was in literature, and like I said, I've been a naturalist for 30 some years. You learn a few things when you do. You record as much as I can, and that's what I've done. And in this case, it serves me well for when I'm presenting because I collect a lot of information. But again, other people have written about them or whatever. It's the stuff that we don't know much about, the things which are hard to tell apart. Many of the other insects, that's difficult because people know what a butterfly is, know what a moth is, but most people never heard of an antlion. Most people never heard of a scorpion fly. Most people never, there's lots of these different things people never heard of. And so we don't know much about those. But the things that we do know about, people have written about it, and therefore I recorded it. And I just stolen from them. So there you go. Okay, was there another question?
No, not now.
Okay, good. And I just realized that I need to plug in my computer before it goes blank in the middle of the presentation. My goodness. All right. Anyways, so that's that. So let's continue on and look at the next one. And those are the maples. Again, sorry, that's my dog. I got German Shepherd. But anyways, these are the maples. And again, maples as a genus, okay? They host 297 caterpillar species, so they're way up there, okay? And we have lots of local ones. It is another, madcap horse. M is for maples. It's another opposite branching tree. And here are some of the common ones we have. Silver maple, which is silver maple because as the backside of it are very, very white. Box elders, poison ivy leaf, look to them, that kind of a thing. And sugar maple, of course, turns bright red and is where we get maple syrup from, whatever. And we do have an invasive here. We do have Norway maple. And one good way of telling them apart is it does look a lot like sugar maple. Is break off a piece, especially not in middle winter or something like that, but in the springtime, especially if it's wet or something, and see if any white residue exudes from where you broke off that little branch or that little twig. And that's a good thing. If you can squeeze out any white juice out of it, then you have a Norway maple, which is an invasive plant. We are trying to control it in our parks, but it's a lower priority, I think, to some of the other more invasive species we're trying to do. And of course, red maple. And I go here a little bit more into red maple. So red maple itself, again, I have a blog on this one too. Yeah, it's got the red colors, which gives it its name. It's got some really cool foliage to it too. What's kind of interesting is this one it may be on its way to being pollinated by insects as well. It is wind pollinated, but there are tons of things, especially honeybees and things like that, which come and visit the flowers as well because it's so early blooming. And because of this could be one of those kind of halfway ones where most maples are wind pollinated. The wind carries the pollen from one to another, but in reality, this does appear to at least have some insects that also help to pollinate. So that's kind of a neat thing. This is a fairly common tree, and one of the reasons it's so common is because it's deer resistant. The deer don't like to eat it very much, and I'm not saying it's deer proof. There's no such thing as deer proof. Okay, we know that. So it's deer resistant, that they sometimes prefer other things. Now, when there's too many deer, which is what we have in Arlington and what we have, in most of our Northern Virginia parks, then they'll eat other types of plants. We know this, right? And but this is not the first one they go to. The deer candy, strawberry bush, things like that, they eat that first. But when they can't find that anymore, then they go down to the second tier, third tier, whatever. This is one of those which is further down the food preference angle of them, but they will eat it. But it's one of those that they eat last, least of all, right? So it's deer resistant, and kind of a neat thing. It's planted all the time. In fact, here in Arlington, we're trying not to plant it as much because, frankly, the samaros, those little seeds that twirl in the wind, much like the tulip tree has, spreads it in the wind. And so, frankly, we don't really need to plant very many because it comes up on its own, right? But it's been planted because of its beauty and so forth, very, very commonly in many of our plants. So again, it's a cool thing. It can tolerate a wide condition. I see them growing in a swamp. I can see them growing on the edge. It can do a lot of this. It can get up by about 90 or so feet tall. It can live about 150 years or so. It blooms fairly early for a tree. After 5, 6, 7 years, it starts to bloom itself. It's because it's got it doesn't have very shaggy bark or whatever. It's pretty smooth bark. It's not that resistant to burning. Okay, lots of things that they have smooth bark is not as resistant to burning, for example, as other ones are. So that is one of the things that sometimes controls it. And again, as far as indigenous uses, the Cherokees used it for controlling cramps, measles. A tincture of it was used for diarrhea, all sorts of things. They even used it as an eye wash, which also Ojibwa mentioned that, as well as Porcher. Porcher, a lot of the stuff that he used, he learned from some of the indigenous peoples, and he wasn't dumb. He says, if they think there's value in it, I'll copy it too. There may be value in them. He did test it when he could, but when he didn't, he sometimes repeated. In this case, he repeated the use of it too as as an eye wash when you have things in your eyes and whatever. The Haudenosaunee, which some people call the Iroquois, but that Iroquois is not the word that they use. The Haudenosaunee is the word that they usually use. These people of the fire. They also use it as an eye wash. They also use it for things we don't really think about. They say that if you could deodorize your traps with this, so that the wildlife would not hear you, would not smell you, and would fall easier to your traps and so forth. They even made some bread out of this stuff. The Potawatomi also thought you could use it for deodorizing your traps. So things like that. Down in the South, the Seminole, which was a combination of different kinds of tribes that kind of went together. They used it for sore limbs, for when they had hurt muscles. They even used it for hemorrhoids. Okay. And again, you can use any kind of maple you can get maple syrup from, but this is vastly inferior to sugar maple. And because of it, you'd have to get so much pails of this to get just a little bit of sugar maple, which is not considered a good use of it. And so people don't. Okay. So that's red maple. Another big one to talk about is wild black cherry. Again, I have a blog, not a blog, I have a YouTube video on this one. So again, wild black cherry is the dominant cherry that we have here. It's the tallest cherry that we have around here too. It is another keystone tree. 456 caterpillars have been documented as feeding on this tree. Not only that, but those the rum cherry, the rum cherries, or the wild black cherries, are fed upon by a ton of birds. 84 of them, different kinds of species, been noting on them. And of course, people can eat these things or make rum out of them, which Porcher was really good. It's really funny, you talk about all sorts of medicinal uses, and of course, a lot of medicinal uses had to do with liquor, right? There are more in his Confederate Ethnobotany. There are more mentions of way to make liquor than any other thing that he has mentioned in there. Because if it makes you feel better, it makes you feel better. So, anyways, but as I mentioned, 34 different kinds of mammals feed on this as well. Okay, so this is number 2. After oaks is number 1, but after that, this is the number 2 most important wildlife plant as far as caterpillars are concerned than anything else. Now, Starting again with with the tribes who recorded the most of the uses for this. The Cherokee use it for colds. People still use it for cold medicine, at least, right? They use it for the flu. You can make a kind of a wash from there for treating things like sore throats. People still do that now, although now I think it's more to cover the taste of other ill tasting medicines. Colds, used to use a poultice of this for treating all sorts of cuts and sores and whatever kinds of wounds you have on you. And Porter had several recipes about using this for making good liquor. So again, wild black cherry, a pretty important plant, and one of those that people have used for quite a bit. And people still do it. It's a very commonly planted tree. The birds spread it quite a bit. And it is one that can really, most people think of cherries and they're small. People think about the imported Japanese cherries that we have or whatever. This can grow to a very, very tall tree. Okay. Anyways, that's a little bit about wild cherry. Oh, actually, before I move on, I'll stop every couple of trees or whatever, and then are there any questions about those two species we covered? If not, I'll continue on to the next one.
Yeah, you do have a question about,
Okay.
Tara is asking, I believe last week someone mentioned this tree is hard to find in nurseries. Tara, do you mean the cherry tree? And she says, what makes that so?
It doesn't. Again, things like this is a very common tree. If you go in the woods, whatever, it pops up all over the place. But when something is so common, people look at it and say, it's not worth for me planting. Because it's also a canopy tree and it can grow very, very big. Another reason people aren't crazy about it. The other things that kind of hinder its use is that this does have something akin to cyanide. Okay, if you to chew the leaves and things like that, you can poison. You can get poisoned by it. And people think that many of our trees have ways to protect themselves, whether it's the tannins on the oaks or whatever the case may be. But because it's got that little thing that it can be quote unquote, toxic because of the cyanide, another reason why people tend to not want to sell it or plant it as much. And frankly, when most people think of a cherry tree, they think about the Japanese cherry. So if they're going to plant something that people are familiar with here in the DC area, they're going to try to sell you a Japanese cherry. Okay, one of those, but one of the two or whatever different types of Japanese cherries as opposed to this one, because yes, wildlife value may be important to some of us, but not so important for other people, where they just want a nice looking tree that's not too big and can put in your yard. And a lot of the Japanese cherries, just flowering cherries, fit that. This one does not. Yeah. Anyway, that's my answer to that. Anyways,
I would just point out that Earth Sangha Native Plant Nursery sells it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those specialist types of things, and of course, and it's important to support these kinds of groups out there and whatever. And is it this weekend that they're having their work day? I can't remember, but I hope I didn't miss it.
Their open house?
Yeah.
That's October the 6th.
Okay, so it's 2 weeks out. So you guys should support them. They really do have some great stuff out there. They're great people, and they're very, very generous with their time and their volunteer work. I've learned a ton from the Brights, and want to consider them good friends of mine and so forth. And so it's great, when people are sharing their advice and so forth. And I've learned a lot from several different people, and as far as trees and things like that, I can point to three of them that I learned the most from, and those were the Brights. Matt Bright in particular, because I talked mostly to him, and of course Rod Simmons, who is the natural resource manager for Alexandria. He did all the plants and I did all the wildlife, right? So we always work good team together. And then Charles Smith, the natural resource manager, or who also recently retired from Fairfax County, another great presenter, another guy who has intimate knowledge. And those three, as far as trees, I mean, I've learned a lot from lots of different people, but those three, as far as trees, I probably learned the most from, I think, than any other person out there. So it's great whenever you see those guys making presentations and things like that. Highly encourage you to listen to it. You will come, and I've listened to them numerous times. You will always come out learning something new. Those guys are an endless wealth of knowledge. Anyways, but we'll continue on. So let's go on to this one, another pioneer tree, the eastern red cedar. And again, it's actually even called a, it's called a cedar. It's really a juniper, and it's pretty good as forest hosting stuff. About 42 different caterpillar species, and but it's really good at birds. Okay, the fruits that it produces, that produces are eaten by 90 different birds. This is one of those that, and one of the reasons it's a pioneer species is the birds feed on it. They fly a little ways, poop out they go to a bathroom and outgrows a new cedar tree growing. And that's why you see these all along, especially along edges of highways and stuff like that, where there are fence lines. Why? The bird lands on the fence line, poops, and then a tree grows, a cedar tree grows right out of it. Fairly fast growing. It is one of those favorite trees that for example, deer use for rubbing their antlers. Deer seem to like cherry trees and things like that. Things have a nice odor to them. They use that quite a bit, for rubbing off their velvet and stuff like that. But otherwise, though, they don't prefer to eat it. Some places slightly different, because if you have an overpopulation of deer, then something that's green, in particular an evergreen, which is what this is, then if it's green in the middle of winter, then you're calling attention to yourself and people will use it. But it does have two different kinds of leaves to it. It's when it's young and small, it's got really pointed, sharp types of leaves to it, and that discourages herbivores like deer and other things from feeding on it. And when it's older, it's a much flatter looking thing, and that's because it's basically overtopped how high some of these herbivores can feed on it, and therefore it can change so much shape. But anyways, a great little tree. And believe it or not, there are some interesting things. For example, I think it was Porter who mentions that even a recipe of making something akin to gin out of it. Okay, so he uses that. But you also have to remember, though, that in particular with this particular tree, it has been shown to be not that great for kidneys, in particular people who may be pregnant or things like that. So, be careful. There's lots of things out there, and people that studied a ton of these things, but there is some research that says it's probably not good, for people doing that. But there's some great mythological things to this one. So believe it or not, people used to plant cedars right by, right near their houses, right near their entrances and things like that. And why was this? Well, they thought that the needles or whatever was planting there would be really good at keeping witches at bay. So this Halloween, when the witches are coming by or whatever, this is one of those things which supposedly would keep them at bay from not entering your house. So kind of a neat little thing about them. Again, there I mentioned Porter using it, using this as an alcoholic drink. The Cherokee also used it again for colds. They thought that the berries in particular were good to get rid of stomach worms and internal parasites, so they used it at that. They also thought that a compound of this stuff would be good at relieving itchy skin. Okay, and for that reason, they also use it for things like measles. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, used it for rheumatism, for colds, coughs, whatever the case may be. So this was a pretty important plant as a pioneer plant, and is kind of a neat little plant. A neat little tree that's very common in most areas. Is a pioneer tree. It's one of the first ones to take root in many of our old fields and edges of fields and things like that. And then we have this one, commonly planted for really good reason. And I have some in my yard, right? And that is the various species of serviceberry. Some people call them shadblow, juneberry, shadbush. Again, I've got a nice little write-up on this one too, and figure why they call it juneberries, right? And again, the berries, which, here's some on the top right hand, you actually see I collected from, the little tiny, I have a one of the running serviceberries, one of the short ones. And I collect, tons of serviceberries, juneberries from it. And it's great. Not only do I like to eat them and so forth, but 42 birds agree with me, including things like cardinals and doves, mockingbirds and catbirds in particular love to feed on this thing, right? But 42 different species have been documented as feeding on the actual fruits themselves. And again, I wonder how many feed on 124 caterpillars that this supports, right? And as far as mammal species, well, there's people eat it, but 24 different kinds of other mammals have also been documented on it. When it's in bloom, it's a beautiful edible landscaping type of tree, right? You get landscape with its beautiful flowers in the springtime. Plus, if you're lucky, you can get some of the fruit out of it in when it's actually in fruit. But in the meantime, it hosts a ton of different kinds of pollinators. Now, couple of things about this, and that is this, and it's closely tied to this one. There is and also hawthorns. There is a rust, and the rust uses an alternate, both cedars and hawthorns. And when you have that during some wet years in particular, you may not get very many of the berries themselves because the blight or whatever gets on there and forms what something called mummy berries. They're not edible. They don't look very good to eat and so forth. And that can happen quite a bit, but it's all dependent on the weather. Some years I get a ton of fruit. Some years I don't get a ton of fruit, and it's just all weather dependent on what's out there. And it's true because I have 10 feet away from my service berries, my little running service berries I have a cedar tree growing. Why? Because again, I realize that it supports so much different kinds of wildlife. Plus, it's an evergreen tree. I know that our wildlife uses as shelter in the wintertime. So I'm keeping that tree, okay? And a little pine tree there too. Okay, so I do have it right there, but here it's right close by. I shouldn't get any fruit out of this. Is supposedly these this fungus will get to it, but that's not the case at all. There's some years I get tons of it, sometimes I don't. As far as uses by people, again, another one that was used for diarrhea. And again, I think it was, I don't think it's the fruit, it's actually leaves themselves, were also used ingested again for controlling as a vermifuge. And by the way, you'll hear a lot of this, how people use a lot of things for worms. I don't know how many of you guys have traveled to foreign countries and things like that, but worms are a real thing when you're feeding and foraging off the land and things like that. Okay. And so this was a huge issue no matter what people there are, which is why there were so many different medicines in order to combat that, whether they're wormwoods like Artemisia or whether some of the things that I mentioned. These are things that people use for controlling these internal parasites, because the internal parasites, of which there's dozens of different kinds, were that common. Okay. So anyways, the Haudenosaunee used this also for hemorrhages and actually also for gonorrhea. So there are lots of different uses that people had for service berries themselves. Before I go on to the next one, any questions?
Yeah, let's see. Somebody's asking, going back to the red cedar, is it a type of evergreen that if you cut off a branch, it doesn't grow back?
That's a good question. I think not, and the only reason, because if you do top off, I think what you're thinking about is things like pine trees, where what's it called, a determinate what's it called, determinate stem? No, what is it called?
Yeah,
where you take the top off, that's seriously going to affect its growth and things like that. I don't think that's the case with this, and in particular because in this particular tree, as I mentioned, deer and things like that love to rub whatever on them and whatever. So I don't think that's the case. In fact, if you were to chop it down, a lot of times it sends up root sprouts, but again, that can happen with pines and stuff too. So I am not sure. That's one we would need to investigate. I'm not 100% sure about that one. So we should look at that at some point. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, let's continue on with northern spicebush. So northern spicebush is a great little thing, all sorts of different kinds of things. Now, I will mention this is one of those which is very, very deer resistant. And because it's so deer resistant, right now, most of the understory around waterways, like our streams and so forth, are made up of two different understory trees, pawpaws and spicebush. Why? Because the deer hate to eat them. So the deer eat everything else. That allows these things to outcompete them. And so it does, we do have our understories are made up of many of our woods, mostly of things like northern spicebush and things like that, and much less things like hazelnuts, much less things like the strawberry bush, much less things like our native not viburnums. What do you call them? Shoot, now I'm forgetting the name of them. They're really pretty flowers. anyways, so this is, and the reason being is they don't prefer to feed on this. They prefer to feed on something else. Therefore, this becomes much more common in our way. Now, it does not support very many caterpillar species. It only hosts 11. And even though these are high, the fruits are high in proteins, lipids for migratory birds and so forth, but only 17 bird species have been noted on there. So again, it's a good native plant. It supports a few things, whatever. But when you're exclusively, when this makes up most of the understory, which it does in most of our forests, and pawpaws make up the other, and most of the other types of plants are not as prominent, that is a problem. You need diversity, and it's good to have this kind of tree on there, this shrub on there. But at the same time, if it's out competing the other trees, not because of what it's doing, but because what in this case deer are doing, that is a problem. So this is now the most common understory tree shrub that we have, and along waterways, pawpaws also are another one of them. Now, as I mentioned, it does have this. It's pretty cool in the springtime. It's really, some people call it forsythia, whatever. It is shade tolerant. There's some neat things to it. And some of the medicinal stuff is really, really cool. So the leaves themselves, if you've ever pulled off a leaf, it smells very lemony. It's very, very cool, cool smelling. And even though the deer don't like it, because I think it's a benzoate, that the chemical in there, even they may not like it. To us, it actually tastes fairly neat, and it makes for a very invigorating tea. So people make tea out of the leaves themselves. Now, a completely different tea is made if you use the twigs. If you use the twigs themselves, then guess what? It makes a more medicinal type of tea. It's much stronger tasting and so forth. And so in wintertime, people use that as a kind of a medicinal type of tree. And then the berries themselves are very, very strong. They were used as a substitute for allspice. So a little bit of berry goes a long ways, but it's great for meat tenderizing, things like that, venison, whatever the case. It's really, really good for those kinds of things as well. So the small little tree, but lots of uses that people have for it, whether it's the teas from the leaf, the teas from the twigs, or using the substitute for allspice on the berries themselves. So a neat little thing. Now, I'll mention again, I mentioned the shade tolerant. The Cherokee, they used it for colds, for coughs, whatever. They also thought that the bark on it was good for measles. They thought that the bark was good for when you had hives, that sort of thing. It was just one of those things. It is as I mentioned, the allspice, the berries themselves were used for cooking all sorts of different kinds of meats and things like that. That's kind of it. The Chippewa, they actually also use these things for a different reason. They actually use these berries, these berries themselves, to kind of cover up sometimes strong flavored meats. Okay, so they used it for that reason. That was the Chippewa. The Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, again, they used the twigs for colds. Again, as I mentioned, a medicinal type of use. They also thought that burning these things in steam baths were really good at relieving things like fevers, measles, even syphilis. So they used it for those particular reasons as well. So that's a little bit about northern spicebush, one of our most common understory shrubs that we have. So another tree that we have is American beech. So American beech should not be as common as it sometimes is, but it is another deer resistant one. But even though it's deer resistant, it's not resistant to fire because there's smooth bark or whatever. It is another tree which holds on to its leaves. It shows marcescence, holds on to its leaves in the middle of wintertime. In fact, some people used to use the leaves themselves for making mattresses and things like that because they were easy to find. They were dry, they would be off the ground, so they use it for that kind of thing. It hosts 127 caterpillar species, so it has some decent wildlife value there, and lots of different things like to eat the fruit themselves. These little triangular nuts, right over here, you can probably see little triangular nuts that are found in there, which born there. So lots of things used to eat them, including, believe it or not, at one point people thought that this was one of the most important passenger pigeon food. So when we had passenger pigeon, which was at one time the most numerous bird in North America. When we had those, this is one of the main things that they like to feed on, was when these things had mast ears. Much like oaks have mast ears, these things can also have mast ears, where they produce a ton of a ton of different kinds of nuts, right? So they do that. The as I mentioned, it was used for mattresses and bedding. These little long thin buds, I don't know if you can see my cursor, were actually kind of neat. People actually used to write with them. I'm trying to remember if it was Audubon or I'm trying to remember which there was an artist that actually used these in the woods to actually, as basically paintbrushes and so forth. So, it is kind of a neat thing. The root word for beech actually refers to books, and unfortunately, people continue to carve into the wood of American beech, which is of course very bad for the beech itself, right? But people keep doing that. But it is a very common plant, again, because the deer don't like to feed on as much. It's much more common in our woods now than would normally be the case. As some other different kinds of it, it's actually a heavy wood, and so it's been used a lot for carpentry. But it had some other uses too. And one of the big things is that the actual wood themselves, you could bend it, which was kind of a neat thing if you've seen the thing. All right, and because this particular kind of wood has no really odor to it, like some other types of wood, it was used especially for food storage. Okay, because you didn't want to impart any odors onto the foods that you're storing. So this was used for those particular those particular uses. Now, some people thought, I mentioned the mattress use of the leaves themselves. Some people actually used to think that or at least it's a superstition, never really been proven, that the leaves would be good at keeping bed bugs away. I don't think that's going to be that's probably the case, but that is one of those things that people have used it before. Now, people can eat the edible nuts on here. However, some studies have shown that eating the husks themselves or too many of the nuts could cause problems because it's considered to be a narcotic in high doses, and so not something that you want to you want to consume a ton of. But again, most of the, and you can actually see it on here, most of the seeds, the nuts on there, you will see are heavily parasitized. For any kinds of things, whether it's hickory nuts, oak nuts, beech nuts, whatever, one quick test to see if they will germinate or not is to do a float test. You take the nut and you put it in water. If it floats, it means that the inside of it has already something is eaten away of it. It's got dry spaces. It's got the air spaces inside of it, and therefore it's not going to be good for germinating or for eating. Okay, and so that's a test for it. If on the other hand it sinks to the bottom, then that's a pretty good clue that it's probably a good thing for propagating and things like that. So it's called a float test and used very commonly to see if something is either edible and it's a nut, or if it's something you want to propagate. Okay, so that's kind of a neat thing. So again, I'm going to just mention a couple of things just because I always think that's the superstitious uses of it, whether, as I mentioned before, whether it's keeping witches at bay or whatever. This one, people thought that having this planted near your house was, for whatever reason, good at keeping lightning strikes from hitting your house. And so people would think having this nearby was good to have, to keep the lightning at bay, as it were. So that kind of a neat thing. The nuts themselves, not only were edible, but the cherry actually used them again for intestinal worms. Just shows you again, worms were a common problem for many indigenous folks all over the world. Okay, the Haudenosaunee, they used something slightly different. They used some of the bark and so forth to actually treat burns or whatever. But they also thought that this could be used for causing abortions, and so they did it for that. They used it for that too. And they also thought if you mix this with bear grease and so forth, and you put it on your person, it was good at keeping mosquitoes away. For whatever it's worth, I mentioned that too. All right. Anyways, I don't know if I've gone through two or not. I'll go one more and then we'll stop for questions. So let me just go one more. So let's go with the viburnums. And viburnums, we have 4 local species, okay? But these are good. These are small little shrubs, multi-stem shrubs that grow underneath. And there's a couple of them for a lot of different habitat types, right? They 104 caterpillars were recorded feeding on them, and 35 different birds have been seen to feed on them, and at least 11 mammals also feed on the fruits. Okay, so these are some pretty neat things. By the way, on the last slide on this presentation, there is a ton, not a ton, because just like I mentioned, some things are missing, right? But I do have some of the little YouTube videos I have on there if you want to learn more about them in the last few slides. At least you can look them up themselves under YouTube or whatever. But it's on the last slide. So a couple more things about viburnums themselves. We have four local types, okay, that we have here. Okay, there's a fifth one which might be borderline along the Potomac River, but it's not commonly found. So really four which are commonly found in the understory that we have around here. But we also have numerous viburnums which are invasive, which is sadly why, because they got pretty flowers, and because they have pretty flowers, these viburnums, of which there's well over 100 and some different species, have been used in landscape trade and things like that forever, right? And so people continue to use them. The four local types we have, the most shade tolerant and one of the shortest we have is maple leaf viburnum. And maple leaf viburnum, again, the leaves look just like maple, but again, it produces flowers that other that a maple tree doesn't really produce, and it produces fruits, which again they don't have some arrows like the maples do. So that's maple leaf viburnum. That's the most shade tolerant that we have. So that's one of them. And then we also have one that's called the arrowwood. Arrowwood is very showy, and it's showy enough that's sold all the time in a landscape trade. And the more sun you give it, the more fruit it'll produce, and also the more flowers it'll produce. And that's kind of a neat thing. And it's called arrowwood, and it has very it's got dentations along its leaves. I should have put a picture of it on here, but which is why it's called viburnum dentatum. It's got teeth basically all along the edges of it, but very shade tolerant, and it's called arrowwood because away from rivers and things like that, finding a good straight piece of wood it's a stem is very hard to find. Okay, and luckily near rivers and things like that, you can use common reed, that sort of things as a substitute for them. But out in the mountains and things like that, finding a straight stick was hard to find. And what did they use? They use arrowwood. I have something when I do, like I was at at Riverbend, they had the Native American Festival a couple of weeks ago, and I had examples of this, whatever, big, long, straight pieces, and you could cut them off, and we were great for making arrows, right? That sort of thing. So again, a very cool thing. And then we have black haw, which is sometimes called wild raisin, prunifolium, because the leaves themselves look like cherry leaves, like prunifolium, like a cherry. They're very cool, and they're called wild raisins because they're they have big seeds in here or whatever, but it's very sweet tasting. And again, it's one of my favorites. Me and my granddaughter like to go out there and get some of the black haw wild raisins for us to eat or whatever. But it's a good one, high wildlife value. Most of these, by the way, but in particular, black haw will sucker. So you plant one and it just suckers up and forms a nice little understory of these little types of plants. The more sun it gets, the more fruits it produces. However, it can and is in most of our natural lands a fairly shade tolerant tree. Just doesn't produce very many fruits when you do that. And the last one, which is the hardest, the hardest one to really find around here, outside of the one that I think I told you is only along the Potomac Gorge and things like that, is possum haw. And possum haw, which has beautiful dark coloring for the fall, it's also called withrod, or it's a bog plant. It likes it really wet, and so forth. And it's viburnum mutum, and it is really a plant which is fairly picky as far as what kinds of terrains it likes to. It's not going to tolerate dry different places. So the place you can find them at places like Barcroft along the edges of streams and things like that, where when it changes color, it has a really cool fruit. Now, it is said to supposedly have edible fruits. Now, I have tried them. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you need to prepare them or something before you eat them. I don't. In fact, I almost got sick. I mean, I don't know if some of you guys maybe a while ago when Scott Graham used to be our natural resource technician, and Scott and I would go over there, and of course we're in Barcroft, we're doing these kinds of things, and I mentioned to him it's edible, and so Scott and I said, "Oh, hey, let's try one." So they were all in fruit. We said, "This is perfect." We had a couple of them. We started eating them, and we looked at each other. We didn't say a word, but both of us probably thinking the same thing. That's disgusting. And finally, we finally admitted, because we didn't want to be the first one to admit that that the supposedly edible fruit was not that edible. But once we mentioned it, we spat it back on and said, okay, if it's edible, you must be one that you really have to be hungry to eat that thing. Anyways, that's a little bit about viburnums. Anyways, any questions about those things that I talk about, and I'll wrap things up in just a little bit with the last few slides. Anything about viburnums?
Not about viburnum, but Tara
yeah,
was asking about beeches. She said, why are they more common now? And she said she grew up near Clifton and had huge beeches, at least twice the circumference of the ones in the picture.
Yeah.
So why are they more common now?
Because the deer don't like to eat them. Again, a lot of in the last 20 or so years, a lot of our landscape has been changed dramatically by deer. Okay, the overpopulation of deer has made certain plants much more common. Pawpaw, spice bushes, maples not as much, but beeches or whatever, and other things much less common. And things like pinkster blooms and strawberry bush and these kinds of things, which are no longer that common. So the deer have altered the landscaping of, or have, by simply feeding on some things, allowing other ones to outcompete the other ones, and that's one of the things. And since they don't like to feed on them, and because another thing they used to keep beeches under control was fires. Now, of course, when a fire comes up, we keep Smokey the Bear, all that, we keep fires from burning. And so it's not controlled by fires as well. And as it's escaped those two things, by being freed of competition and herbivory pressures, by allowing it to grow. And the other thing, that there's no fires to control them. For that reason, the beeches now are starting to really dominate some of our woods, much more so than they would normally be this type of year. That is my understanding of why beeches now are a little bit more common nowadays than they were half a century ago or whatever. So just a little bit about that. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, good. So let's continue on with a couple of interesting ones. And this one I always like, and one is because it's extremely common. You find it growing all over the places. Whoever's doing that walk, I think, yeah. This is another one that's found in Long Branch. Anyway, elderberries, and the one we have here, we do have it, not in, it's never recorded in Arlington, but it is in Fairfax on the Potomac River. We do have red elderberry, but pretty much all the other elderberries we're going to have is what they call either common or black elderberry. Okay. And it's a cool plant. It suckers very frequently, so you can see nice patches of it. And if you chop it down, it grows right back again. So it's very, very good of it. 120 different bird species have been noted to feed on them, especially woodpeckers. Woodpeckers love to feed on these berries, but then other things do, thrashers, catbirds, mockingbirds, whatever. And even warblers will feed on these things as they come through. All right. Now, other things feed on them too. One of the things are 42 different kinds of caterpillars, which again, as I mentioned, support them, the bats that feed on them, and support the birds that feed on them, whatever the cases may be. And mammals feed on them too, but I'm going to mention something about that in just a second. So about 14 species of mammals will also feed on the fruit, and that could be people. However, I will mention a couple of things about eating the fruit here, okay, before we continue on to the other thing. One of which is another author I'm going to mention is Samuel Thayer. Samuel Thayer is probably the best forager around. He has what, I think 2 books out about foraging, feeding off the wild, and all these kinds of things. And he is, in my opinion, the best forager around now. He is the guy to go to learn about what things are edible and what things are not. And it's really, really true. I mean, there's lots of people, like I mentioned a few things, and yes, I've tried some, and sometimes unsuccessfully, as I mentioned with the possum haw, right? But I've tried a lot of these things, fine. But But many times when people find edible plant books and things like that, people repeat things that they've heard of before. And that's kind of one of those, one of those things. Hey, Alex, I'm actually here doing a presentation, please. Yeah, that's my son yelling at the dog or whatever, and not what I need, another distraction. But anyways, now in fact I'm forgetting what I was mentioning here. I lost my line of thought. Oh yeah, Samuel Thayer, that's what it was. Yeah, so Samuel Thayer, has written all these kinds of things, and most books again repeat these kinds of things. Hey, it's been recorded. I mentioned some of them here. Porter mentioned this, Porter mentioned that. Believe it or not, I had not made liquor out of all of these different things to try them. I just mentioned them, right? But people mention this, and so in many of these edible plant books, and one of the reasons now also because different people respond to different fruits differently. I mean, some fruits are of necessity, some with things have to pair that way, and different people have different tastes, right? And so I could tell you something's edible, somebody tries it, and it may not be, like the possum haw was, right? So in this particular, hey guys, if you want to put yourselves on mute here, got enough distractions, please. But one of the things about it is they put a disclaimer there saying, hey, I'm mentioning these things for knowledge sake and so forth, and I'm doing that right now, telling you a lot of these things people have tried all of this stuff, but the disclaimer that if something happens to you by eating it, hey, I'm telling you, it affects different people differently, right? So there you go. It's different with Samuel Thayer. In his two books, he has a claimer. In the beginning of the book, he says, look, I don't like all of these edible plant books and all these kinds of things where they tell you don't eat this. Well, what good is an edible plant book if you can't eat the thing? And so he has a claimer saying, look, I have tried all of these fruits hundreds of times, and I'm standing behind that they're edible. I'll show you some of the ways that I make them edible, and you can feed on them. So he is the guy when it comes to foraging. And Samuel Thayer, though, does have some interesting things for this. And one of them is that, and people still, you can actually go there and see some bukas being sold in different kinds of, like in Walgreens or some of these pharmacies as a thing for combating viral infections or for treating against the flu. And in fact, kind of a neat thing. I don't know how many of you guys watch Walking Dead, but in one of the episodes of Walking Dead, the vet there, who was also their doctor, they were all getting sick and stuff like that and whatever. And he basically tried to come up with ways of helping them along. And what did he use? He used elderberries as one of his ways of treating this illness, right? So kind of a neat little thing. Now, Porter, he also had lots of uses for these things, not just as liquor, which we know about elderberry wine and so forth, but he used it as a laxative for treating rheumatism. He also used it for syphilis. He also said he thought, and he stood by this. He actually has a quote. I can't remember what the quote was. That if you washed wounds or something with an ointment made of these things, it actually helped keep the flies away. Now, he thought that the flies were for a different reason. He didn't understand about carrying diseases, stuff like that. But he did understand that keeping flies away was not always what you wanted to do around sick people. So he did mention that as another use for it. And believe it or not, some people still believe that you can use these, you can use this for actually repelling different kinds of flies. Now, as far as other things, one of the Algonquian speaking groups actually call themselves the Algonquians. They actually use the bark as a laxative, and as I mentioned, some people cook the berries and then you can eat them, and some people eat them raw. However, I have tried them raw, and it's a very strong taste for them. And so be very, very careful. There are some people who tried them raw, and it's not good for them. In fact, as I mentioned, one of the tribes, the Algonquian tribes, they actually used them for inducing vomiting. So you got to be careful with how you do these kinds of things, right? Other ones, though, like the Delaware, which gives us the state of Delaware up on there, the Houma, the Oklahoma, the Rappahannock, the Cherokee, all of these guys use a poultice of these for treating wounds. Okay, again, the idea that perhaps Porter may have been onto something, that it was good for disinfecting wounds and things like that. So they would use it for that, a poultice out of it. But the Cherokee also used it for rheumatism. They thought it was that it was really important for treating burns, for that kinds of things too. The Haudenosaunee, headaches, cuts, fevers, mumps, all sorts of things. Another group of tribes, the Dakota, the Omaha, Ponca, those three different kinds of tribes, they made an interesting beverage out of blossoms and fruit, which they did not consider to be alcoholic. So, there were a lot of uses for black, or what's sometimes called common elderberry. So it's a cool plant. The other interesting thing is it's got the stem of it is very soft pith to it. Because it's so soft, it's a favorite place for certain kinds of mason bees, osmia bees. That's the genus for mason bees. Osmia and Seratina bees, which are some of the small carpenter bees. They actually will use them for actually building their nests. And so they, now we put up boxes for them and things like that. But this is one of the natural things they use them. They hollow it up because it's easy to get the pith out of it, and they lay their eggs, layer them all off with, in the case of mason bees, mud, and then continue on making different cells, provided with both pollen for feeding the young bee, as well as lay one egg per them, and so forth, right? And animals have figured this out. And so you'll sometimes go by elderberries and you'll see a ton of them all ripped apart. And they're ripped apart by things like woodpeckers and titmice and chickadees. Why? To get at the larval bees which are inside of there. And so kind of a neat little thing about it. So it does provide a type of habitat for them. And even if it gets chopped down, it goes right back up again. So it's a very durable tree. It forms multiple stems because of this. Different stems will break off and grow back up. And it doesn't grow really big. 4, 12, 15 feet high is about the tallest that you can get. Another big plus in this is another plant that is somewhat resistant to deer. That deer don't like the taste of the leaves themselves, and therefore that it is one of those things that resist deer quite a bit. Okay, so that's a little bit about elderberry. Let me go on to the next one, and then I'll be open for questions. Let me just go on to the next one first. The next one's Eastern Redbud, commonly planted, and why not? I mean, look how beautiful this tree is, and so forth. Eastern Redbud, and again, I have 2 different blogs in this, including I'll actually tell you a story about the Judas tree here. But this is a neat little plant. Now, it doesn't support a ton of caterpillars, only 19, but however, tons of pollinators do come to the flowers to feed on. Okay. It also supports 13 different kinds of leafhoppers. There are 6 different beetles that have been found growing on them. And you may notice on leaves where there's neat little holes chopped out of them. Why is that? Those are leafcutter bees. And lots of legumes are, but this one in particular, you'll find leaves and all the edges chewed out of it. This leafcutter bees will come take a little piece out of it, and they use that for forming the different layers of their cell from when they're. So mason bees use mud, leafcutter bees use leaves. So you can actually see the nice, neat little things which have been cut out by the bees when they come through there. So it's a favorite from them to do this kind of thing. I mentioned pollinators, and this thing flowers beautifully. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's planted as a short, as a tall shrub and whatever. But it also displays something which is mostly found in tropical plants, and that is what's called cauliflower. Cauliflower is when there are blossoms growing straight from the stems. Okay, and that means that these will also have seeds hanging from there, right? And so this cauliflower is kind of neat. So you can actually find whole stems just covered in flowers, just growing right up the stem. Yet another, appealing thing of why it's used a lot as a landscape type of trees. And what a neat little thing, if you do pull off the flowers, which by the way are edible, like most legumes are. Most legumes you can eat the flowers right on them, whether it's black locust or this or whatever. But they do form they do look like little tiny hummingbirds on there as well. But but it is a very, very cool tree with this with this with, as I mentioned, this interesting trait of growing the flowers straight from the stems. Okay, cauliflower. Now I mentioned that the flowers are edible, slightly sweet and so forth, but the young pods, and it grows like bean pods that grow on there, and before they turn big and old, the young pods are fairly edible. Okay, and people would use them, mix them into dishes and that kind of thing. It turns yellow in the fall, which is kind of neat thing. It's not a long-lived shrub. It's planted. It's an edge type of plant. Whatever. 75 years is a very long life for a very, very old redbud. But it does bloom early. After 4 or 5 years, it tends to start getting its first blooms. Because of its beauty, it's been adopted as the Oklahoma state tree. And as far as indigenous use for it, the Alabama, which the state of Alabama has been named for, that tribe used the roots for treating fevers, and they also thought it was really good for congestion. The Cherokee, as I mentioned before, there's lots of things about Cherokee because they were the first tribe to actually have a written language. They used it for treating coughs and so forth. The Delaware state, right up north from the Oklahoma, again, two different tribes with two different states named after them. They used it in two very interesting and very diverse ways. One, they used it for treating fever, but at the same time, they also thought that eating a lot of this would be good for inducing vomiting. And believe it or not, that was a trait. Sometimes you want to induce vomiting, get rid of something that's bad for your system or something like that. So two different uses of the plant. It may have been, and I'm not 100% sure. There's not a lot of information listed as to how they were prepared. It may be that two different portions of the plant were used in these two different ways. So, for example, one other thing that it was used for, the roots themselves, you can get a red dye from the root. So it was used for that. So I did mention this, and again, you can read about this a little bit more. Let me see if I can remember the legend to this. So Eastern redbud, Circes, has some relatives in the Middle East and so forth, and including in places such as Israel and Palestine and all of these places out there. Okay, and when people got over here, some people tended to apply some of their legends to the plants that we have around here too. And one of these things happened to be the legend of the Judas tree. And the legend goes something like this. And by the way, Judas tree, it may have actually, the name Judas tree is for Judas Iscariot, which, according to Christian to Christian stories, was the betrayer, of course, of Jesus Christ and so forth, right? The kiss and all of this for a few coins, and then he regretted it. And because he regretted it, so much so that it was said that Judas Iscariot decided to kill himself. So he wanted to hang himself. And the story, I guess, just a legend, is that he found a nice, big, tall, growing tree that had beautiful white flowers. And it was such a strong, sturdy tree that he thought that this would be a good one to hang himself from. So he hanged himself from the Judas tree, which was apparently one of the species of redbud. Because of that, the story goes that the Judas tree was so ashamed of what purpose it had served that it immediately decided, or whatever, that it would no longer grow big, tall, and strong, or whatever. It would be short, multiple stems. It would not support a person's weight, that sort of thing. And not only that, the white flowers immediately began to blush because of the shame, and it no longer grows that way. So the Judas tree, and by the way, it may one of the other names for the Judas tree is actually Judea's tree, because he used to grow in that part of the country. Those legends are applied to here, and a lot of Christian legends are applied to many of the things that we have here. I have one more story I may tell you if we have time at the end, but many of those stories that come through here because many of the Christian stories have been written down and so forth. So that's just one of those stories. Before I continue with one last little piece of this. Are there any questions about these couple little trees that we talked about before I continue on with one more last thing?
Just a comment. Clay says that he took a bare elderberry stick and stuck it in the ground and it grew leaves.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that there's many things like willow and things like that that they're experimenting on. We've been doing some experiments, and our landscaping crew, as well as ourselves in our greenhouse, of trying different kinds of things. We think we tried different viburnums. That's another one that's known for this, where we took the thing, stuck it in the ground, and of course willows. We know that's what they do. You know, that's a very common thing, is to insert willows into the wet ground, sometimes with have pheromone to help them grow, sometimes not. You stick them in the ground and the moisture, it grows right back up. Why? These things are used to willows being used for being chewed by beavers, whatever. They're pretty good at recovering, right? And it is true also that some viburnums do the same thing. And we are kind of a mixed type of thing. But elderberry could very well be one of them. It makes sense. It's, again, another one that can be chewed by beavers. It's another one that grows by the edge, oftentimes by the edge of riparian systems, by lakes and ponds and whatever. And so it's another one that grows by places where the beaver lives. So it makes perfect sense that they can take some of these kinds of things and quickly establish itself just from stems that are inserted into the ground, much like willow and some viburnums can. So it does not surprise me. Any other observations? Any other questions?
No, not right now.
Okay, so I have one last little story too. Let me see if did I include it? Gee, I'm forgetting. There's a couple of things I want. So first of all, these are just a few of things. I did include one section if you wanted to read just some general things about wildlife and things like that. I have one of my blogs on my Capital Naturalist page is Wildlife Shrubs, and I talk about several different shrubs and so forth that have wildlife value. So that's kind of pertinent for one of the things that we're talking about today. But I also, and this is certainly not inclusive there. But Devil's Walking Stick is in here, so that's good. But there's lots of different YouTube videos and blogs and things like that through here that if you wanted to kind of look through there, you now have a little bit more. You can find a little bit more about these different kinds of plants and their uses and so forth by looking at it right on this in this list of different kinds of things. And by the way, I know that we're talking trees and so forth, but I'm actually one other thing, and I'm slowly working my way in writing, and again, the work gets in front of the way, right? Unfortunately, I don't have time to do this, but I'm slowly working together. Next spring, I hope to have out my spring wildflower book. It'll talk about ethnobotany, it'll talk about wildlife uses, talk all about these things about our spring wildflowers, and then the following summer, I will then hopefully come out with my summer plant book, and then followed by the fall plant book, and then 4 years after that I will have my shrub book. So I'm working on all these books as time permits, but like I mentioned, unfortunately, as I'm not retired yet, I don't have time to work on this on a regular basis, but hopefully you enjoy them when they come back out there as something to kind of learn a little bit more about and become more involved with it, because it's great learning the names of something, even the scientific names or something. But I think that if you learn more about the plants, how they're used either by wildlife, how people use them, or whatever, then they hopefully something out of that will allow you to maybe remember a little bit more about that. And I think that's an important little thing. I think just learning the name, it can go in one ear and out the other, specifically scientific names. But if you learn a little bit more about how it's got its name, how it was used, what the wildlife uses were, hopefully something about it will stick and you'll remember that a little bit better. So anyways, I provide some of these as some additional types of things that you guys can kind of look at, whatever, for your interest, if you're interested in that kind of thing. And again, here's my contact information, and I'm going to wrap up, I think, with one final little story. And then if there's any questions, that's fine. But otherwise, you guys get out early and I can finally get to eat. So it's all good. And that's going to be this little story. I usually tell this when I'm doing my winter walks and things like that, but I'm going to tell it to you guys right now. And if I remember it, geez. Anyways, this is a story that's told by the Seneca people. They're one of the Haudenosaunee, one of the quote unquote Iroquois tribes from up north. And the Seneca have this story. Okay. It goes way back when there was this constant battle that was going on between the spirits of winter and the spirits of summer. Okay. And they would fight it out, and about half the time, there's, during certain times of the year, the spirits of winter would win, and then the spirits of summer would come back up, and then they would fight them off. So this was a fairly well thought of fight, but sometimes one side would have a much closer edge to winning these battles than the other one did. And it was after one such time when the spirits of winter were winning so much more. It was one of the longest winters that the Seneca people remembered, that this story supposedly came about. They say after one of these brutally cold winters, that winter had lasted for such a long, long time, some of the trees were getting sick and tired, and they wanted summer to come back. Okay. And so they all got together, and it was decided, okay, we need to figure out what we can do to support the spirits of summer or whatever. And so they invited all some different types of trees in there, the chief of which was the white oak. And, he called the beech, and he called several other different members, but mostly it was members of the oak family. And the oak family all got together with the white oak leading and saying, look, we want to show support for show support for all of these kinds of things. That's great. Even more so, there is another group of trees that is really leading the way on this, and those are the evergreens. And the evergreens, in particular, the pine, the white pine in particular, they are set that they think that they can show great resistance to this. And how is that? Well, white pine then spoke up and he said, look, we're coming up with this great little concoction, and this concoction is going to be this potion that if we take it, we will not lose our leaves, and therefore we will show them that we're supporting the spirits of summer. And all the pines, whatever, that's a great idea, all this, that, whatever. However, one of them, another member of them, the bald cypress, was saying, wait a minute, I, this is all great that we're having here, but why are we allowing the white oak to be in here, and some of these other trees? They're not even members of our tribe. They're not evergreens. Why should we be allowing them to partake in this mission? They're not members of our tribe. And there was some argument going back and forth and this and that. And a lot of people said, look, more allies is better than less allies. And yes, they're not members of our tribe, but if they want to join us as allies, why should we not allow them to do that? And we think that we should allow them to be part of this mission as well. And after all of this, bald cypress got so upset that he flew off in a huff. He just left and said, I don't want any part of this. And he left. So at the time then, they fixed this little potion, whatever, and they decided all of them, they would partake in it. So all of the evergreens, the pine trees in particular, took this potion. They said, look, we're taking this potion, and now this will allow us to stay green the whole year round. However, bald cypress was not there to partake in it. And they decided that they would not give it to some of the other trees. They could, do whatever they wanted to, but they were going to hold that just for their own tribe to do. So they partook the potion. There you go. Now, that winter, when the spirits of winter find out about this, they were furious. It was the worst winter ever. Blaring blizzards coming through, blowing everything out of leaves, all of this and that. But still, the pine trees held on to the leaves. They were still holding strong, all except for the bald cypress, who did not partake in this, and therefore it is one of the evergreens that does lose its leaves. Okay, and so it's one of the conifers that no longer has no longer holds on to its trees anymore. Now, some of these other ones, they didn't have the potion, but they were still saying, we're going to do this. And so things such as the oak trees, and things such as the beech trees, and things such as the musselwoods, all of them said, we're going to hold on to our leaves as long as possible. Now, the spirits of winter blew on them. They started blowing left and right and whatever. And soon the leaves, since they didn't particularly in the potion, they started to turn brown and so forth. But they still held on to the leaves, and they still hung on to leaves almost all winter long. And then finally, when the spirits of summer finally won the war, they were there again, and they regrew their leaves. And they say, the Seneca people, that if you listen closely on these windy days and the wind is blowing through some of these oak trees and beech trees and so forth, you may just think that you hear that the leaves are rattling and that they're that they're moving in the leaves. But if they say, if you listen really closely, you'll actually hear what's really going on. And what's really going on? It's that they're laughing at the spirits of winter because they know that at some time the spirits of summer will be triumphant and they can return back to their royal splendor. And that is the legend of the evergreens as interpreted by me, one of the Seneca stories. Now, folks, again, I'm going to stop sharing now. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you guys and do all this kinds of stuff. And I hope that, if that some of you guys might be able to, participate in and follow me along my social media stuff. And if not, I look forward to, I led one walk not too long ago with you guys. I really hope that I'll be able to find you guys out in the field or whatever. Please come up and say, hey, I'm a tree steward, I'm this, whatever. Love all of our volunteers. I love the work that you guys are doing. If you look at our natural resources unit, there's 3 of us, right? Okay. And at one point, it was just one of me. I loved it when I first formed my unit. I loved that it called a unit and it was me, right? And it said, wow, you're a unit. But the county had plans, and the plans included changing a few things up. So we now have Jennifer Souls, so you guys may know as our basic plant coordinator. And now we use Sujung Kim, who is our natural resources technician. And that's it. There's 3 of us. And even though we're a small county, there's no way we can do things on our own. But, and I am, by the way, next week, I am turning on the performance measures. They asked me to keep track of all these things or whatever. And when I do, I am always amazed at the great volunteer work that we have. The efforts that are put forth by volunteers such as yourselves is incredible. I feel so blessed because there is no way that we could accomplish the stuff we do without people such as yourselves volunteering and doing this. So I tip my hat for you. Thank you very much for volunteering and doing all these kinds of things. I encourage you guys to continue with this course, learn more that you can, because you're educating people, you're volunteering, and do all this kind of stuff. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, as well as from Arlington County. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. If you guys have any questions, I'll be here for a little while longer. If not, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Alonso. Thank you so very much. Anyone have questions? Just unmute yourself and chime in.
I have a question that I don't want to keep you from your dinner.
No worries.
Can you just briefly touch on the role that trees play in keeping insects overwintering?
Yeah. So there are a couple of ways of looking at that. Okay. So one is the actual structure of the trees and things like that. So I mentioned, for example, the oaks, right? What was it? 61 wood boring beetle. These wood boring beetles are inside the wood, and being inside that thing offers shelter, provides all this stuff, and that's how they go, as well as providing food for the woodpeckers and things like that, right? So that's one way that does it. But what's mostly ignored, and we really don't want to ignore, is what happens with the duff. The duff layer, which is all of the fallen leaves and things like that, which soon people are going to, sweep off. They're, sweep off. They're going to have them all hauled off or chopped up or whatever. That's important because most of our insects, I'm trying to remember what it was. There was a percentage of them. I'm forgetting this, but there is a certain percentage of how many, for example, moth cocoons actually are pupa that actually stay in the duff, in the layer underneath the leaves. So when you come through and you blow all those leaves away, you scrape them all up, you put them in bags, they have them hauled off, and then you're wondering, where of all the insects? Why don't I have anything going there? Well, you just took out their overwintering stage, whatever the case may be, and you hauled it off. And when you did that, then you have to wonder, well, that's next year's food supply. That's next year's type of thing. So I encourage you guys, when you can, maybe leave a corner of your yard and pile some of the leaves over that way. It's best if you don't mow over them. I mean, if you do, it's you're still at least keeping the leaves in there, and that's some of the things may survive it, but mowing over it will chop up some of these cocoons and things like that. But the duff layer is very, very important, and it's something that every year We see people hauling on off huge bags of leaves. And yeah, I got it. There are certain places you want to keep, whether it's your lawn and things like that, you want to keep it a little bit clearer. But if you leave a certain section, you allow that anything that you prune or whatever to pile up in there, sort of a brush pile, something like that in the corner of your yard, then you're allowing some of these things to overwinter in that way. So there's lots of different ways. Some pupa, some chrysalis, things like that do attach themselves to trees. But what we forget is most of them, including eggs and things like that, are dropped into the soil and into the duff layer. And you're scraping those away and you're shipping them off. You're destroying a lot of the insects, which then affects, 96% of our land birds and all of our bats, that kind of thing.
Alonso, if we have a Nandina, but you don't want to take down the Nandina, should we just cut the berries off?
Yeah, cut the berries off, and then when it comes time to replace, don't plant another one. Plant a native plant to support more thing. What was a Nandina supports one caterpillar species? It may not even be that. Nandina, again, it's not native, nothing evolved for it. It doesn't produce very much, and there is at least some research that says that with certain types of birds, it can cause issues. The one bird in particular is the cedar waxwing. So here's one of those interesting things. I mentioned 96% of the birds feed on insects or whatever. One of the birds that does not feed on insects are cedar waxwings. Cedar waxwings are frugivores. They feed on fruits, berries, or whatever. That makes up 90-some% of the fruit that they eat. So they go following the fruit, and when they find the fruit, they gorge on it. Okay, it goes through their system. They're great at planting seeds here and there, whatever. But that means if they land on your Nandina bush or whatever, and they gorge themselves, they will feed on it so much more that to them it can and has caused issues where it can poison those birds. And so, for that reason, alone, it's just one such thing. People do use that. You say, hey, don't plant Nandina, it kills the birds, all of this. It doesn't kill all the birds or anything like that, but we know that with certain types of birds, in this case, things like frugivores, such as cedar waxwings, it can do that. And again, at least chop off the berries. And this is true of any kind of plant you don't want to spread or something like that. Get rid of the berries or whatever. And so it doesn't reproduce and spread into woods and things like that, because that's the problem. Then it becomes an invasive. We have to deal with the thing, which we don't want to do. We're wasting enough resources on doing certain things. We don't want to waste any more on something which is easily controllable, such as just cutting off the berries so it doesn't reproduce, and then replace it when it can with a native plant that offers more wildlife value.
Thanks.
Any other folks? Well, thank you, folks. I hope that you enjoy it. I think you have the PDF or whatever. You're welcome to use it for whatever it's worth. And hopefully this provided some information for you in a different kind of strain. I know that, most of them say it's identification, is that whatever. Here's a kind of a different look at I think in this case, woody plants than perhaps you're used to. And there you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was interesting.
Thank you, folks. Until another day then.
Wonderful,
All right.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.